Hey everybody, Matt Johnston here, and we're back talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we're going to talk about something that's a little bit different and generally applies to certain kinds of service-based industries. Before we get started, I really would appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button that you see down there below. If you click the bell, you'll also get notices when we have posted new content. Now, most people are familiar with the Americans with Disability Act's requirements for public access. So we're used to seeing ramps, and we're used to seeing wider doors and grab bars in the bathrooms and things like that. That's an important part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but there are other requirements that the ADA requires. For example, if you are, and you may have seen this at banks and things of that nature, you may have seen on the for example, an ATM has Braille on the keypads so that people will know what they're pushing so they can enter things like their PIN and things of that nature. Pretty common, and we see that probably not without much thought as to why. One of the funniest things that I often thought was hilarious, but it makes sense when you think about it. I often thought it was very, very funny to have Braille on drive-up ATMs. But since the ATM manufacturers just manufacture the ATMs, they don't know where it's going to be put. That's fine, but I always thought that Braille on on drive-through ATMs was very, very funny. Have an odd sense of humor, I suppose. But let's say you're a service industry, for example, a bank or a medical office or a dentist office, lawyers, accountants, things like that, and you have clients and customers who are deaf. You may be required to provide sign language interpretation services. Now, if you are in a professional setting, and this came up with a client of mine who is a medical practice, the question was, are they required to provide a sign language interpreter for deaf patients? And the answer is yes. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires a business obtain whatever services or accommodations or changes are necessary for that business to be accessible by all persons. So if you have a client who is deaf, you may be required to provide a sign language interpreter. Now, in the modern world, we now have texting, and it's very, very easy for those who are deaf to be able to communicate much more readily and quickly with individuals by use of text. You see it all the time. It's fantastic. It's very, very useful. But if the person doesn't have the text, or if what you're going to be doing involves some technical stuff, such as medical diagnoses, you may be required to provide a sign language interpreter. So where does one find sign language interpreters? Well, that's a really good question, and there's a couple of very, very easy answers. First, you can call the local court system. The local courts, because they are places of public accommodation, they have sign language interpreters who are available to work with those individuals who are deaf who are in the court system for whatever reason. Just as there are Spanish language or French or Vietnamese or Chinese or whatever, just as there are other language interpreters, there are sign language interpreters available. And often if you call the clerk of the court, they can put you in contact with somebody who does sign language interpretation. The public school system is also a good facility to go to. Back when I was younger, I used to substitute teach, and I remember a particular middle school that I was at. There was a hard of hearing child, not fully deaf, but hard of hearing, and so there were sign language interpreters there. And for this one child, there were 2 interpreters in the hour-long class because, well, it's a lecture class and there's a lot of information, and sign language interpreters do get tired. So you can contact that, and of course you can also always break out the Google machine and you will be able to find some folks to do it. Now, can you charge additional fees for the sign language interpreter? No, you may not. the cost of a sign language interpreter has to be borne by the business. And if that means you kind of lose money on the transaction, well, that's sort of I guess that's the cost. But the reason why I say that is oftentimes, for example, in a medical setting, the doctors might be involved. It might be a 15-minute appointment. But most sign language interpreters require payment for at least an hour, and sometimes two. So how do you handle that? Well, one of the best ways that you could do it is maybe stack your patients who are hard of hearing or who need a sign language interpreter, have them be available for multiple appointments and just sort of stack those appointments at one time. It's a method of doing it. There are other ways that you can handle it. But a service-based business, you are going to be required to provide that sign language interpreter. But what about a retail business? Technically, yes, you'd be required to provide a sign language interpreter, but it's generally not going to be required because the interaction is brief, it's fleeting, it's maybe it's 2 or 3 minutes at a register, and that can often be handled by text messages or writing on a pad or something of that nature. So just be mindful that the accommodations that are required by the Americans with Disabilities Act are not just physically access, but it is the ability of those with disabilities to access the goods and services, which means you may have to provide other kinds of accommodations, such as sign language interpreters or Braille or things of that nature. So just be mindful, based upon what your business is, that is something that's going to be required. If you're not sure, hey, give us a call. We're happy to speak with you, figure out what your specific situation is. If you have any questions, you can schedule a consultation using the link down there in the show notes. In the meantime, go out and watch some live soccer. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.